20 years ago. She went to the University of South Florida in Saint Petersburg with an honor from the honors program with a degree in geography and concentration in conservation and a minor in environmental policy. That's pretty awesome. Let me just stop right there. But she started a vermicomposting business called Laco Worms and Vermicast LLC while she was a student still at USF in 2016. During her 3 years there at school, she was vice president of the garden club and managed a 3,600 square foot food forest. One of her responsibilities was for the worm farm composting red wiggler worms that digested food waste and turned it into organically fertilized soil. And then they would use that vermicompost to nurture the trees and plants in the food forest. And it was at this time when tending to those worms and watching the impact of this fertilization process from the worms made on the plants was astonishing. So at that point, she decided to create Laco and use it as a medium to help her relocate food waste away from landfills and turn it into vermicast naturally to fertilize the soil. As a geographer and a human on this planet, it was her responsibility to help this beautiful earth we live in, and there's no better way than worm poop. So after graduation, to further knowledge on the indoor hydroponic cultivation and took a job as a cultivation specialist and true lead in pheno hunting facility in Clearwater, Florida. And after 2 years, she decided to move to her current job and working from home, facilitating and taking care of her own worm farming business. So at first, few customers, but like with anything, if you have a strong staying power and a good product, you're definitely going to get some more customers moving in. So we'll hopefully get her some more in this audience and in the future. But without further ado, we're going to present our speaker. And when you're ready, Ana Quintera, you may go ahead and click the share screen and start whenever you're ready.
Okay, sounds good. Hello, everyone. Can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Okay,
yeah, everybody's muted right now.
Okay, perfect. So the way that it's pronounced, it's Laco. It's Laco worms and vermicast. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I would get right to it. So I think that most people are really familiar with composting. I'm aware of the fact that composting it's much easier to do because all you have to do is just throw all your food scraps into a pile and you just add any type of browns, because whenever you compost, you do need your browns and your greens. Your browns it's your carbon, your greens is your nitrogen. So when you have a composting pile, I think the city of St. Pete actually for a short period of time was distributing these small containers that you could use for composting. And I've had a few conversations with people that have one of those. And what's unfortunate is that not a lot of education comes with the product, or if there was some education, it was not attached to the container itself. So maybe the information was lost. But what I'm getting to is that with composting, since you're just throwing stuff into a pile, you kind of forget about it, because it's going to take about 6 to 9 months for that whole process to turn all of those food scraps and all that wood and everything that you put in there to decompose. And the temperatures are going to be very hot, and there's going to be microbes that love that really, really hot temperature. The only thing is that you do have to turn it yourself. Usually you need to use your tool, whether a fork, any type of tool. But with the worms, the great difference is that it takes a much shorter amount of time, because the worms are digesting the food scraps or the waste that you can put in there, because in addition to food scraps, they can also digest cardboard or egg cartons, which are the two things that I use the most. And the worms digest all this and they turn all of this into organic fertilizer in only about 8 to 12 weeks. So because it's such a short period of time, it's a lot more friendly, in my opinion, for people that have a garden at home. Because you can create your own soil with your own production of food waste. You can get your friends and family to maybe collect some food waste for you. And you can maybe obtain some untreated mulch from the city, which is what I do as well. And then you can add that to your mix in your worm farm. So give a little bit of visual on what an actual worm is. It's pretty much an intestine all the way. It has a gizzard, just like a chicken, from the mouth to the tail. It has 5 hearts, which I think it's something very unique. And in the neck section, there's something called the clitoris that's right in the middle of the screen. And in that section is where they have their sexual reproduction parts. All worms are hermaphrodites. They have both male and female, but they still have to mate with another partner. So they usually sit up in 69 and they exchange their fluids, and then they develop a cocoon. And I actually do have some cocoons here. I didn't really bring worms because I felt that it was kind of too much, so I don't know. But there's a lot of cocoons in here. It's those little yellow kind of balls. And in each one of those cocoons, there are many different little worm babies. So the worms can produce an egg capsule in about 7 to 10 days. And it takes about 14 to 21 days for that capsule to develop. But then the environment has to be specific for that capsule, which is the cocoon, to actually hatch and for the worms to actually come out. Some of the variables that you need to have in this good environment are pH, the humidity, the temperature, the amount of food, and also the population of the worms, because I think that they use that little tiny brain that you see on the screen to control the population. They self-regulate their population. If there's too many worms, they won't reproduce. If there's not enough worms, if temperature is going to change, for example, right now that the temperature is about to drop more in Florida, they will start reproducing because they are maybe expecting the population to drop with all these cold temperatures, and they want to make sure that their hatchlings are there to eventually hatch in the future. So the main thing that I do with the worms is that I try to follow the certain guidelines, because there is not a very regimental instructions out there online. If you go out there and you look up worm farming, you're gonna have all kinds of different ways of worm farming. Everybody has a different opinion. Everybody learns differently through experimenting with their worms. So I do have to say that some of the things that I learned at the beginning when I was reading about worm farming have completely changed after I've spent time worm farming. So the bottom on the right of the screen, you're going to see the type of worm farm that I took care of for the university at USF. It's called a Worm Factory 360. I'm probably gonna, I will talk about that at the end of the presentation on where you can find that and other type of worm farms. But basically it's just a stacked tray system. The trays have holes at the bottom, each one of those trays. And because it's a tray stacked on top of each other, there's ventilation throughout the trays because you want to make sure that air circulates. Since the worms are kind of going up and down through the different layers of the worm farm, they're creating these tunnels, and these tunnels are helping that heat also come up. Since heat rises, you want those spaces that are on the outside of the trays to be clear and clean. You also want to make sure that you keep your bin in a shaded area. You don't want direct sunlight because high temperatures can burn the worms. So there's some tools that I would certainly suggest to have in addition of your worm farm, to also have your probably a pH tester and a humidity tester and temperature thermometer measuring device. So some of the things that, from my experience, again, most of the information that I'm giving you, it's after several years of worm farming, because at first, a lot of information did talk about not giving any type of citrus to your worms, and that's a problem that unfortunately would kill them. And I have given just small amounts of, let's say, a few orange peels or lime peels or lemon peels or onion, and just one slice of onion doesn't hurt, but half an onion, I wouldn't suggest putting that, or 5 different pieces of onion, of orange, I wouldn't suggest that either. So as long as you keep something that is citric to a smaller amount, it's fine for the worms to digest it. For the fruits and vegetables, anything that is not very acidic, it's totally okay. And as you can see on the screen, there's a list of the green and brown matter that you want to have. As I was talking at the beginning, you want to have your carbon and your nitrogen mix, because the worms need some space to be able to burrow. And if you only give them food scraps, it will also decompose in a way that it might attract bacteria, and you don't want that. So at the bottom of the screen on the right, you can see a bucket that I suggest to get whenever you're putting your food scraps away to then feed your worms. One of those buckets that has a sealed lid, because that's one of the things that does attract flies, especially black soldier fly, which you were talking about earlier. So some of the suggestions that I have on the maintenance of your worm farm are listed here. The most important ones are not overfeed, as I was talking about previously, because you don't want that anaerobic decomposition. We want aerobic decomposition, and we don't want to attract bacteria or pathogens or anything negative that might also hurt the worms. And when you also overfeed, that excess of smell of the composition, it's what attracts your black soldier flies as well. So you want to make sure that before you add more food, new food to your worms, that they have eaten everything. Like I said, all the different tools that I talked about before are probably great ways for you to make sure that these different things that you need to keep in mind are always happening. I mean, I check my worms on a daily basis. I feed them on a weekly basis. I have 4 personal worm farms, and then I have the worm farm that I take care of at USF at school. And I mean, I love spending time with them. So, I mean, I would spend as much time as I can, but if you do want to commit to worm farming, you want to keep in mind that it is time consuming. It's not a lot of time, but you do want to check on them at least every other day, and you want to make sure that they have the food that they need, that the moisture is the moisture that they should have, that it's not too wet and they're going to drown, that it's too dry and they're going to fry, that it's not too hot, that it's not too cold. And it's not, it sounds a lot more difficult, but it's not as difficult when you keep measuring all these different ranges of the things that you need to be aware of. So some of the worm farm visitors that I think it's important for anyone that's going to worm farm to be aware of are on the screen. The most popular one is black soldier fly at the bottom. The right is the fly, and then at the top on the right is the larvae. The problem with black soldier fly is that it raises the temperature of the worm farms, because the larva eats much faster, digests much faster, and that temperature is not good for the worms. So I have had circumstances where the flies left some eggs, and I had to at first remove them by hand because I didn't want the temperature to kill my worms, and I had to add ice. And then eventually I built this enclosure with a screen around my worm farms to make sure I can keep these black soldier flies away, because they unfortunately can become a little bit of a problem. They compete with the food, they eat the food that it's supposed to be there for the worms. When they digest the food, the poop that they create, the worms can digest that. I did experiment on having a worm farm with both worms and the larvae at the same time. And it is something that's feasible. It's just very hard to maintain a low temperature that is gonna satisfy both of them, because the larvae prefers to have a very hot temperature and the worms don't. They prefer in between kind of 80 degrees, and if it's too high, maybe 85 degrees. For the lower, maybe the lowest could be 40 degrees. So when it has that range and the larva, it's raising it up to 120 degrees, it's just absolutely going to fry the worms. Centipedes and the snake that you see on the screen, they were found on the untreated mulch. The same with the spider, those were found in the mulch. There is a different type of spider that I've dealt with the worm farms, but they're there to help control just population of all the different critters in there. There's mites, so certainly the more little critters you have, the better. I don't think that is bad to have any of these things. It's just important to be aware of all of them, or some of them popping up here and there. So I do recommend to use gloves whenever you're handling the worms. There's a lot of people that don't care about using gloves, but I do strongly recommend using them in case you just have a surprise. So these are the three main products that you're going to deal with when you do worm farming. You have your worms and you have your vermicast. The vermicast, it's what the worms produce after they digest all the different food scraps or the different waste that you might give them. The vermicast, it's very high in micronutrients and macronutrients. The macronutrients are NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Micronutrients are usually minerals. The most important ones that vermicast has is iron, sulfur, and calcium. Calcium also comes from, it's one of the things that I do add. I shred eggshells and add them for digestion. The worms like that, so that kind of also adds that calcium on the vermicast. The texture of the vermicast, it's interesting because it's a little bit spongy when you feel it in your hand. So it definitely proves on the fact that it holds water longer when you put it on your soil, and it is water soluble. So by being water soluble, it makes the nutrients directly available for the roots of the plants, and it will not burn the root system. Different from whenever you use, for example, raw manure to fertilize your plants, that can burn the roots of your plants. So some of the services that we offer is the worms. We have different amounts of worms. Certainly the amount of worms, it's kind of related to how much food you produce a week per household, because the worms can eat their weight in 24 hours. So if you have a pound of worms, it can eat a pound of food waste in 24 hours. So one way for you to kind of figure out how much food waste you produce, you can just weight your food waste, create a different container, just a bag, and put your food waste for about a week or maybe a couple weeks in there. I mean, probably just a week, because it's probably, unless you keep it in your freezer, because I sometimes keep food waste in the freezer during the summer to give the worms to kind of cool them down. But after you weigh that out, you can kind of figure out how much food waste you're producing, and then you can figure out how much in weight worms you need to decompose that food waste. We also offer the vermicast, which is the soil that is the outcome of the digestion of the worms. There's also a soil mix that we make, and the soil mix, it's mostly untreated mulch from the city. The vermicast and the clay pebbles are used for hydroponic cultivation, and it's mostly to create more space for the roots to expand whenever they're growing and whenever they're absorbing the nutrients. And also worm farming education for all ages and consulting as well, because there is all kinds of questions that can come up depending on where you're worm farming, not only geographically, but if you're doing it outside or inside. So what to do next? The main thing would be, like I was saying before, to figure out how much food waste you're creating, or also, depending if you're not so much focused on the food waste and you're more focused on your garden, then how much food waste do you need for you to be able to create a certain amount of vermicast for your garden? Because let's say if you need more food waste for a bigger to cover a bigger surface area, then you can reach out to your friends and family members and give them a bucket and collect their food scraps, and then bring them to your worm farm. And you can also look for a bigger worm farm. So once you decide how much food waste you want to have the worms digest, then you want to figure out your worm farm. So the worm farm, Amazon sells everything. So I suggest that, just because it's easier. I just put a couple of images of 2 different ones that are more directed towards a household. It's a smaller size worm farm that you can keep indoors or outdoors. I haven't had any pests come in. As long as you don't overfeed, you don't really attract any pests, because the worms are very good at eating and pooping and eating and pooping and making babies. So as long as they're happy, you just want to keep that cycle going. So after you get your worm farm and you'll figure out how much food waste, or maybe you don't have to figure out the food waste right away, that's something that you can play with down the line. You can contact us, and we can sell you the worms depending on how many worms you want. And after we give you the worms, and you kind of see for the first couple weeks how fast your worms are eating the food, you can reach out back to us, and then we can guide you on maybe if you need to give it more food, or if you give it less food, or if you see any type of strange critter that went in there and you're not sure if it's going to hurt your worms or it's not, because there are certain mites that do hurt the worms. There's leeches that can go in there. We've had leeches go in some of our worm farms that we've had to kill, and leeches can hurt the worms. And there's other worms that the regular earthworm that could go in there but doesn't really hurt. So it's not hard, but if you have any questions once things start coming up in your worm farms, just reach out to us. And the most important thing to keep in mind is that when you're feeding your worms, they need that combination of food scraps and some type of bedding material, because they're just natural bioreactors. They're just there to eat, and unfortunately they don't, they're not like us in relationship to temperature. They cannot warm up and kind of manage their own temperature. Unfortunately, the environment is the one that manages their temperature. So if it is really cold out, if it is really hot out, you just want to be aware of those type of things, and just make sure that you keep them happy, because I mean, it is a great way as a gardener for you to create your own soil. It's unfortunate how popular it is for people to just go to Home Depot and buy a bag of soil, mix it in their lawn or in their yard and water it, and then it rains, and that water is going to end up in our waters. That is fertilizer that is going to end up in our waterways. And unfortunately, a lot of times people complain a lot about the problems of the algae blooms in the ocean right here in our back door, but at the same time they're going to Home Depot to buy a bag of fertilizer and watering their plants and putting that fertilizer in the water. So it's one of those things that it's also easy as a native of St. Pete and just a native of this planet to just do something that helps the environment, helps your garden. I garden with it. And after doing cultivation of cannabis with hydroponics in an indoor facility, and I have seen cannabis with organic soil outdoors. I've seen different type of cultivation with organic soil, that's the vermicast, and non-organic soil, and it shows there is a difference. There's actually, I don't know how much more time I have, but yeah, I think I have 1 minute. So let me see.
Yeah, keep going. You got a couple more minutes. No, keep going. We can get you for a couple more minutes before we start the Q&A.
Okay, awesome. So I just wanted to show everybody this right here, which I think it's pretty cool that when I started with vermicomposting, a lot of research out there was just people's websites that somebody, or people's businesses or companies. Uncle Jim's Farm is very popular, and very little information was out there about research on vermicomposting through universities. And this right here shows that now Ohio State University, Cornell University, Australia, and all these different countries around the world, India, Chile, all these different countries are doing so much with vermicomposting, because it shows the difference on the outcome of the flower. The flower is bigger, the flower is prettier, it smells more. The same thing at the food forest with all the different trees that fruit. The mangoes taste like no other mango that I've ever tried. The bananas taste amazing. There's a mulberry tree. There's all these different type of trees and vegetables, and it shows. So for many different reasons, I very much encourage vermicomposting, is what I was getting to. Just wanted to kind of put this on the screen to show that it is now finally something that universities are studying, that it's important to be aware of. And I mean, if anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out anytime. I mean, I'm in the process of putting together a website. I first wanted to see how popular my worms would be, and I think that now they are very popular and they deserve a website. But that is what I have for everybody today. And if you have any questions, please go ahead.
All right, we got one question here in the chat from Desiree, and she's asking, can I put your worms directly into my garden beds at home? Do some end up staying in the beds, or do they all leave?
That is a great question. And I'm going to answer it in two different ways. So if you just throw composting red wiggler worms in on your raised bed, unfortunately, especially since the temperature in Florida can be very extreme, they might either fry and die or freeze and die or be eaten by all the little lizards that are out there. Most of the times, the worms that you want to have in your raised bed, if it is just a raised bed, it's earthworms. If you want to put composting worms on your raised bed, what you can do is that you can either order a device or you can design your own device with a PVC tube where you can dig holes and put it on your worm bed and put a couple of them. And then you fill that up with food. And then you put your composting worms in there. So you keep that source of food for the worms to digest, and then they burrow through your raised bed. So in a way, you're keeping natural environment for the worms to eat, but also it's fresh soil all the time because they're feeding, and you can probably turn that. I haven't done that. I'm in the process of experimenting with it, but I know there's several people online that have done it. So you can, I'm sure, look up a YouTube video on I would say PVC tube or worm farm on a raised bed, and it will give you a list of examples.
Excellent. Great answer. We also have another one here from Jay. Can I put compost worms into my compost bins? Can I put your red wigglers into my compost bins?
No, unfortunately, the temperature of the composting bin will be too hot, and it will fry your worms. The worms do need a specific environment for them to survive. There's a lot of videos out there on how to make your own worm farm, and I completely disagree with all of them. I do not support any of those videos because it's like if you built your own house. I'm sorry, but it's not feasible, because unless you're an architect, the worm needs to be comfortable in a worm farm. And kind of how I was showing earlier, the stack tray system that I use, the way that is designed, it has ventilation from tray to tray, and then the holes on each tray that goes on top of each other allows the worms to go up and down and create those tunnels that you need for ventilation and for the heat to rise. And when you have just like a regular compost, usually they're just sealed and they're rigid, and even if you turn it, if you're adding more food, it's not the new layer is not separated from the other layer. It's just building on top of each other, because I experimented on making my own worm farm with a 5-gallon bucket, and it absolutely failed. And the worms were trying to escape, and I felt really bad because I felt that I tortured them. So that's why I don't support that. But I understand that, everybody wants to experiment and everybody wants to do things their own at home. So if you want to go for it, go for it. Just from experience, it didn't work out for me, but they unfortunately will most likely die. What you can put in there is black soldier fly eggs, and you can create, which I've experimented with that, and you can create fertilizer. You can attract black soldier fly on your composting device that you have.
Excellent. Great answer. Okay, I got another question here from an iPhone. How do you separate the castings from the worm substrate?
Very good question. So there's many different ways of separating the worm castings, depending on how much time, patience, and money you want to invest in it. There's some devices that you can buy that it looks like a strainer, and they're similar. I don't mean to keep making references back to cannabis, but I don't know if you're aware that with cannabis, there's different sizes of it's like a screen. The screen has different sizes whenever you want to get the different sizes of trichomes. So it's the same thing when you're sifting your castings. There's screens of different sizes that you can use to sift your castings. Then there's also a device that it's circular that you can turn, and then as it turns, it moves the worms and the castings, and then the castings fall from underneath. I've seen some people that have designed a device that has the parts of a bicycle. So it has the two different wheels and they kind of pedal it, and then that's turning the barrel that has the castings inside. I personally separate them by hand because I usually have people that help me because it's very relaxing. It's very soothing. I sometimes meditate while I do it. I play music. I like to think that I play music for my worms while I'm separating them. So what I do, because since the worms don't really like light, what I do is that I take them out. I have this plastic bin and then it's kind of a rectangle. And then I empty out my worm castings and then I do it under the light in a way that I'm separating them from the top to the bottom. So I do the top layer, I wait a few minutes, and they usually, by the time you separate the top layer, they're burrowing to the bottom, burrowing to the bottom, burrowing to the bottom. And as you clear the top, you kind of combine the edges, so you make another smaller pile, if it makes any sense. And then another way that I've also done it is that I've created smaller piles, pyramid type looking piles, and then I go from the top to the bottom, because since the worms will try to get away from the light, they'll just burrow through the bottom. So I personally have the patience of separating them by hand, because I also feel that whenever they're susceptible to vibrations, so I feel that I'm hurting them when I'm shaking them with a tray or when I'm shaking them through a barrel. But I think it's totally okay. I just personally don't do it, but those options are out there.
Excellent. I got another question here. Would the garage be a good place to keep the vermicompost unit?
Definitely, as long as the garage has a temperature that's going to be it's not going to be scorching hot for the worms. So if you want to keep some type of thermometer in your garage, because I know back at the grow, the way that the thermometer worked, it was just like this thermometer, and it had this device that measured the room, the temperature of the whole room. I don't know how you would order that online. I don't know if you can just buy like a thermometer for your wall, because I know I have one of those, and you can just put that in there, and as long as you keep an eye on it, and probably also keep buy a small thermometer and keep it in your worm farms, or check frequently with your worm farms, and just, you know, open the lid on a daily basis or every other day, and just take a look and make sure it's within that range, and it's not too hot, because I don't think a garage will get too cold, because if it gets too cold, you can maybe put like a couple blankets on top, or there are things that you can do to make it warmer. But when it's opposite, it's not as easy, unless if, you know, you run the AC and it goes through the garage as well, and that's keeping, because everybody's homes are so different depending on how you measure, how your garage measures its temperature. You just want to figure out a way to know that information.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any other questions? If you do, either type them here into the chat, or feel free to unmute and talk directly to our speaker. So I'll just leave the mic open there for a second, see if anybody wants to jump in and ask a good question.
Well, in the meantime, something that I would like to offer to the person that asked about the compost container, and I talked about the black soldier flies. I do have some black soldier fly eggs frozen, because they were kind of invading my worm farms, but I didn't want to just keep killing them. So I just have a good amount of them. So if you're interested in experimenting with that, just send me an email, and maybe we can talk about putting that together. It's fun to do different experiments. So if not, no big deal. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Excellent. I know Jay is very interested in experiments. He has quite the home experiment going on right now. So I have a question for you, Anna Maria. Have you ever made your own like bin out of, I know you said out of the plastic containers, but have you ever tried anything like wood or metal or any other
That's a great
experiments?
question. I have not. The main reason is because since the worms need this specific environment, when I tried to do my own container with that 5-gallon bucket, and even though I drilled holes and I glued small screens to make sure that the worms wouldn't escape, and I kept it in a shaded area, it was just really challenging to recreate that design, because I still tried to put a bucket on top of another one, but still the air wasn't there and the worms were kind of trying to escape. So I feel that if I, let's say, recreated out of wood, I would copy the design that I have of the stack tray systems. I know there's a company out in California, and there's actually a couple of companies in Chile that I've connected through the Instagram account for the worms, that make worm farms in wood, and they make the trays stacked on top of each other and a screen on top of kind of each tray. With metal, I think that it's, I don't know how, or if there will be any type of leakage or any type of chemical with the metal, but the metal, I will be more afraid it's with the temperature, because I know that aluminum and metal like that can get very, very hot. So if you have something made out of metal and floor temperature, it will be very, very difficult to lower the temperature, because during the summer I add ice to my worms. During the winter, I try to cover them with blankets and try to make sure I have a good temperature. So that's why I would think that with metal it will be hard to do that. And so now, unfortunately, plastic is what I'm using. And the ones that I tried to do by myself, I was recycling the plastic. I definitely didn't go and buy brand new plastic bins to do that. So the cool thing about doing it yourself at home is that in a way you can recycle or upcycle stuff that you were gonna throw away. But unfortunately, but they are long lasting. I mean, the ones that I have lasted at least, I think, maybe 3-4 years. The one for, no, I'm sorry, 5 years, and the one from USF, it's about 6-7 years. And I mean, it's looking like it should be replaced soon, but I feel that it's only the base that needs to be replaced. The trays are fine. So fortunately, and I think it's also because it's made here. It's an American brand that's probably made in the USA. I think it says around the label, and I feel that also makes it long lasting. If it was a worm farm that comes from China, I think that probably, unfortunately, after 6 months, it will break. So those are the other reasons why, when you want to look for this worm farm, you want to do your research and make sure also that you're buying something that's going to last, since you're going to invest, if you choose to invest in a brand new worm farm.
Awesome. Thank you. I love the way you answer these questions. So in depth, so full of detail, just rich in extra content. So that was, I really enjoyed.
Thank you.
That here. So
happy.
So if you guys have any more questions, you can either reach out to Ana Maria online or here again in the comments. I'm just going to jump to where we're at this presentation, following through here to make sure you can contact Ana Maria if you have any questions. We didn't quite get to your sources here.
Oh, that's correct. Well, and the sources, it's really the first one is instructions from the EPA on how to make your own worm farm. If you do choose to make your own worm farm at home, I mean, there's many different sources out there, but the EPA did a pretty good job with this one, with those instructions. And then right under it, it's same. It's kind of a guide